Our guest speaker today is Julian Smith, an educator, architect, and planner. He founded the graduate program in heritage conservation at Carleton University in 1988 and later helped create the joint Carleton-Trent Ph.D. program in Canadian Studies. He is currently executive director of the Willowbank School and Centre for Cultural Landscape in Queenston, Ontario. He's also a practicing architect and planner. His recent projects include restoration of the Vimy Memorial in France, so that's quite an impressive project. He is co-author of the 2011 UNESCO Recommendation on Historic Urban Landscapes. So please join me in welcoming Julian Smith to the podium.
Thank you, and thank you to the Harris Center. Thank you to Jerry Dick from the Ministry and to Lisa Wilson from the Foundation for their invitations. I'm going to go through quite a few images, but really the message is quite simple. It's about what some people call a paradigm shift in the heritage conservation field from a more static view to a more dynamic view. And so I'm going to start by going through a history of several hundred years of the heritage conservation field in about 5 minutes. People get into this field with certain biases, and that has shifted over time, and I think it's important to recognize that we have these layers in the field of why people are engaged in this interest in cultural resources. So I'm going to go through these, and that's a bit of a time chart along the top. If you look at the antiquarian bias, which is really this 18th century fascination with the layers of history that were embedded in the landscape, and archaeologists were really the first to develop the field in a certain way. And if you go to Iraq or Egypt or India or Sri Lanka or Mexico, you'll find out that the Archaeological Survey is still the historic sites agency in those countries. Those are the places where people are dealing with cultural tourism, with important monuments, but also more generally with the cultural field, because it really goes back to these origins. And to be on the original scheduled monuments list in the UK, which is really the first legislation in the Western world, you had to have a vacant site. If it was inhabited, it wasn't eligible. So this really indicates how strongly the orientation at that time was to these remnants of earlier civilizations, of earlier cultural patterns. And it was interesting because archaeologists, particularly in North America, were trained usually in anthropology departments. So there's a very strong connection between looking at these places and understanding the cultural patterns that they represent. One thing about archaeologists is that they're fascinated by true historic artifacts. If you don't have the artifact, if you don't have the fragile information often contained in very small pieces of evidence, you have very little on which to base your research or your understanding. And so if you take this, these are two illustrations from a book published in 1788 by Stewart and Revitt called The Antiquities of Athens, really the first set of measured drawings of a set of historic buildings. The top image is from the frontispiece and was the Parthenon as they found it and as they left it. They had no interest in restoring the Parthenon. They were simply interested in that as an archaeological site from which they could learn a huge amount about attitudes not only to architecture but to religious practice and so on. The bottom drawing is one of the copperplate engravings, which is a sort of a mental reconstruction of that place. It was fine to do that in drawings, but archaeologists wouldn't have necessarily reconstructed the Parthenon to recreate some imagined reality from thousands of years earlier. You then get a different reason why people get involved in the field, and that's because these places actually commemorate certain patterns which become important to a culture. And I date this pattern to the mid-19th century, to this group, which is the Ladies' Auxiliary of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was George Washington's estate. It had gone on the market. It was going to be sold by the Washington family. This group of women said, this estate is too important to our history as a young country. We should protect George Washington's estate as a way of commemorating George Washington. This is really a pattern that has been more developed in North America than elsewhere, partly because the Americans in particular wanted to establish a kind of national narrative, and the whole emergence of nationalism in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries has been well documented. So the role of, there was in fact a conference in East Germany about 15, almost 20 years ago called Monuments as a Source of National Identity. The role of historic places having commemorative value is very strong. And this is Mount Vernon today. It gets millions of visitors. They just built a new $120 million visitor center. the commemorative role of historic sites can be very powerful. This is Fort Anne, the first National Historic Site in Canada. This is the way it was when the citizens of that area petitioned the federal government to take it over as a national site. And this is an archaeological site. This is a site from which one could investigate the history of this place and of the history of Canada associated with this place. So I would say, in some ways, in this state, this is an archaeological site. This is Fort Anne today. That's the same building that you saw in the previous image in the background, a timber frame building with wood siding and a shingle roof. That siding is now actually concrete because Parks decided years ago that it was cheaper to maintain concrete than wood. It may have since been replaced, but a lot of restoration goes on commemorative sites because this was taking Fort Anne back to a period when you could interpret particular points in its history when it was very important. And the commemorative bias in the heritage field leads often to restoration. Unlike the archaeological interest, the commemorative approach can use these places as stage sets to reinterpret our own history. And Parks Canada and the US Park Service are still at some level basically commemorative institutions who are involved in this process for that reason. Then you get in the 20th century what I call the aesthetic bias. And the aesthetic bias, unlike the role of the archaeologists in that first bias and the historians in the commemorative role, where historians choose periods of significance, the aesthetic bias, architects and architectural historians become very strong in the heritage conservation field. And I date the beginning of this to the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg, which was done for commemorative reasons, but turned into a celebration of 18th century and late 17th century, but an attitude to Georgian architecture, a connection of that to early American identity. And what happened at Colonial Williamsburg was that it turned out that the aesthetics of Colonial Williamsburg became hugely powerful in an environment where contemporary planning and architecture was creating an aesthetic that people distrusted. And so the heritage field became a place where you could connect to aesthetic traditions that people found valuable in the face of a modernist kind of sea that was enveloping them. And so Williamsburg over time has created not only these, this is a completely reconstructed building, in fact, a fairly hypothetical reconstruction based on one copper plate engraving that was at Oxford. Williamsburg now has hotels, bed and breakfast restaurants that are in reconstructed or restored early buildings. And you can go to a local paint store and buy Williamsburg paint colors, reproduction wallpapers, herringbone brick paving, which was a pattern in Williamsburg you see all over the place. Upper Canada Village, Peter Stokes, who was the architect responsible for that restoration, fell in love with the aesthetics of early 19th century architecture. And he carefully eliminated from this reconstruction anything from the kind of unfortunate excrescences of Victorian architecture, because he loved early Upper Canada, and this is Upper Canada Village, which is sort of pre-1867, including the gardens and so on. This is the first heritage conservation district in Canada in Vancouver, Gastown. This is a before picture. That fish and chips place on the right was actually a very popular local spot. This is the after picture. This is the aesthetic approach to conservation, where those beautiful Victorian storefronts are brought back. That district had early guidelines on paint colors, on signage. The paving here, you can hardly see it, is herringbone brick, imported directly from Williamsburg, cast iron street lamps and bollards. You can't do a heritage conservation district without people assuming that there's going to be herringbone brick, cast iron street lamps, and bollards. And hopefully beautiful storefronts with transoms in them. So this is an aesthetic bias that brings people into the field. This is a Heritage Canada poster from the 80s, which had no caption. You didn't need to explain why Heritage Canada was appealing for members. They were saying, you either love this or you love this, and if you love this, you join Heritage Canada. That is an aesthetic appeal. That's not about the commemorative value of that house. This is the first design guidelines ever developed, which was in Savannah, Georgia. This is 4 of 14. If you follow all those guidelines, basically all you can design as a new building in that neighborhood is something that is aesthetically an 18th century house. So now in the 21st century, we're seeing what I call an ecological bias. And this is a different attitude that people bring. I direct Willowbank, which has a 3-year diploma program in conservation using a cultural landscape model and, in a sense, using an ecological model to approach cultural resources. And the disciplines of cultural geography and anthropology, which have typically not been asked to get involved in the design and development process, but rather to be students of the existing situation, are increasingly being seen as representing disciplines that have to be included in this, as well as ecologists who study human ecology. And by an ecological perspective, I mean an ecology that includes the human species into it. And it's actually very important right now that the new Director General of the National Park System is Rob Prosper, who is Aboriginal. And to have a Mi'kmaq person responsible for the national parks is going to bring, well, I know he came to Willowbank to teach, is going to bring a ecological perspective of which humans are part of the cultural landscape. So this connecting the cultural and natural is part of this. But the other significant part of this shift is that all the previous biases had to do with the object as the prime building block. So the building that gets designated, or the historic garden, or the district made up of a collection of buildings. Ecology is about the relationship between objects. It's not about objects in isolation. And so this ecological approach is very much about these places in relation to their larger surroundings. When Parks Canada adopted ecological integrity as a way of measuring how well national parks were living up to their what Parks Canada had set out for them, at the same time they adopted commemorative integrity as a measuring stick for National Historic Sites. And I argued at the time with Christina Cameron that National Historic Sites should have taken exactly the same measuring stick, ecological integrity, to look at National Historic Sites. To what extent are they part of their communities? Do they relate to the landscape that they're in? To what extent are those relationships being kept alive? So where did this come from? Well, it started at the international level with nominations like the Lake District as a nomination for the World Heritage List. It didn't fall under the natural category or the cultural category. It was both, and the UK asked that it be designated under both, and they said we have no framework for that, so they turned it down actually 2 times in a row. The other interesting thing about the Lake District is they said that the importance of the Lake District is partly the way it's been interpreted by poets and landscape painters and novelists, and therefore it exists in the cultural imagination. And I think that reflects our definition at Willowbank of a cultural landscape is a landscape as it exists in the cultural imagination. A historic landscape is something you can photograph. A cultural landscape you can't photograph because it exists in the collective cultural imagination. And also, this is a project in Hungary, also very early in this process, where there was an archaeological ruin, but very good drawings of what it had been like. And what they did was recreate what was missing using very contemporary design. This is a stainless steel network for vaults and so on. This was important because this brought contemporary layer into a historic environment. And that was something that the aesthetic bias was very much against. This is Les Forges de Saint-Maurice, which was a Parks Canada reconstruction of a very important forge site with modern structures which recreate the sense of the industrial complex. The First Nations community in Canada have been absolutely critical to this shift. Their understanding that architecture and landscape are intertwined. Their understanding that artifact and ritual are completely connected. And when the first Spirit Sings exhibit opened at the Glenbow many years ago, it was the Lubicon First Nations who partly protested that if you take a First Nations artifact and you put it in a glass case and you shine lights on it and you display it to the public, you're simply not understanding that a mask is a cultural object when it's danced. And when it's not danced, it's not a cultural object, and you put it away in a closet. And that was a very profound insight that I think the museum community is still struggling 25 years later to come to terms with. At the international level, the Issei Shrine in Japan was nominated to the World Heritage List. The World UNESCO turned it down. They said it's only 20 years old. The Japanese said, you're right, it's only 20 years old because we ritually rebuild this shrine every 20 years to train a new generation of Japanese in the art of temple building. But we've been doing it for more than 1,000 years on the same site, and it's built there, and then right beside it is an empty spot, and 20 years later, it's ritually rebuilt, and the other one is taken down. And they said the knowledge of how to build a temple is equally important to us as the temple itself. UNESCO they developed something called the NARA Charter to deal with cultural value as being culturally specific. Every culture has to identify cultural value in its own terms. And that was a major document. The Venice Charter, which had been the primary document for ICOMOS and UNESCO, they added the NARA document, which is now those two are the two primary documents in the field. This UNESCO recommendation on historic urban landscapes, which came out just over a year ago, represents for me a cultural landscape approach embedded in a UNESCO document for the first time. And this is the first UNESCO document in more than 17 years to address the cultural heritage, the tangible cultural heritage, but it took a very different approach to it. And you can see here some of the words, tangible and intangible, the shift from a primarily architectural and monumental emphasis towards the social, economic, and cultural processes. And processes are dynamic, putting conservation within sustainable development. This is a very important definition, that the urban settlement understood as a layering of historical, cultural, and natural values, and also expanding beyond the historic center. So this isn't historic urban districts. This is the historic urban landscape as a dynamic ensemble. And the last paragraph, using cultural creativity as a key asset within the historic urban landscape, was something that UNESCO had tended to separate out. They had many groups within UNESCO that deal with the intangible cultural heritage and with creative, the arts communities and so on. But to put that creativity within historic urban landscapes as a key to keeping them alive was, in a sense, a new initiative for UNESCO. Two books that I want to refer to by the World Bank. This one, Eco2 Cities, has been very successful in connecting ecology and economy. And Eco2 is ecological development and economic development. And the World Bank is very interested in how these two converge. The World Bank is now working on how you take the cultural stream and put it together with these two to create a single framework for their urban development activities around the world. And Arish Dastoor, this second person on this list, is a key person, and he's from India, and I see as one of the kind of rising stars in the field. This just came out last month from the World Bank, and the economics of uniqueness is great for, in fact, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, that this kind of generic application of World Bank or any international organization's principles to local communities around the world is really turning out to be counterproductive. This is a step in the right direction, but in fact, this book is not in the ecological approach because it deals primarily with this old sense of historic urban cores and individual monuments, particularly as sources for cultural tourism. The object as a source for cultural tourism is really important, and it's part of the commemorative bias, the aesthetic bias. But the ecological bias is about the economics of uniqueness at the scale of the cultural landscape, of the environments we live in, and how those become a normal part of design and development activity. So I want to talk very quickly, I'm just going to run through some examples of what happens if you apply what I call a cultural landscape model, which I define not only as the way the landscape exists in the cultural imagination, but it's the landscape as a physical artifact mapped by the rituals of how we inhabit it. And so the rituals actually map the landscape. And if you want to understand it, you can't photograph it because it's intangible, but you can get people to map it. And it shifts the burden of the expert from the person looking from outside who can photograph it, use GIS systems to map all sorts of qualities. But that's observation, and cultural landscapes have to be understood through experience. And experience is what people who inhabit those places have. And the question is, how do you draw that experience out? This city in India, when I was a kid, our family lived in India, and then my wife and I lived there for quite a few years. So it's a kind of second home to me. This is a 3,000-year-old city, which is very complex. But when I asked people to map it, they drew the center temple with this concentric 4 squares. Why that simple geometry of a city, which in fact was an extremely complex physical environment? It's because there's a set of religious festivals which describe those concentric squares wandering through these tiny streets. And it's those rituals that map the place. And in fact, this mandala, I would say, is in some ways as accurate a map of what it means to inhabit that city, which is the most important cultural city in the south of India, and seen as a source of a kind of definition of how one lives in the city within that Hindu culture. Toronto has a physical form, but if you want to understand that city from the perspective of somebody who's come from Madurai, there's this movie, Masala, which I encourage anyone to look at, which is an Indo-Canadian view of Toronto, which includes, among other things, a religious procession by the Hindu community through the Presbyterian streets of Toronto. And it's that kind of overlapping of cultural realities that creates, in some cases, cultural landscapes which exist on top of each other. And in fact, if we go back to this map of, this temple has its processions, but on the right is actually a different temple which has its own concentric squares, and those people will map the city very differently. And one of the wonderful things about cultural landscapes is that they can exist on top of each other because they exist in the imagination of different cultural groups. We're working with our students right now on Kensington Market in Toronto, and one of the interesting things there is that the counselors are asking that it be designated under some framework that allows both the intangible and tangible qualities of the Kensington Market to be captured. And they understand that the Ontario Heritage Act will deal with the physical bricks and mortars of that place, but not with the reality of the Kensington Market, which is a way of living in the city of Toronto. And part of that has been doing cognitive maps, and the students have begun to write their description of that place. And you can see that this has to do with the intangible as well as tangible qualities. Another example of a cultural landscape approach was this church in Toronto where the Historic Preservation Branch had said you can put condos in it, fill it with condos, put dormers on the roof to allow light in. But the developer was already building a large condo tower and had proposed this solution, which was to take the roof off, there were no decorative trusses or whatever, and create a public park. And the Historic Preservation Branch said, absolutely not. That's destroying the kind of integrity of the object. I thought this was a wonderful idea, and I used Noli's map of Rome from the 17th century, which is one of the most beautiful maps of a cultural landscape of Rome. And what's important about this map is that the black is private and the white is public. So the white is mostly open space. But all the churches are white in plan because for the people of Rome, the churches were part of their public realm. They felt comfortable going into those churches and inhabiting those places. And that's exactly what a mapping of a cultural landscape does. And you can't map that from outside. You don't know what the public feels is part of their reality or not part of their reality. And I said what was interesting about this Deer Park project was that by creating a public park rather than private condos in that church, you're actually keeping alive the tradition of that interior of that church being a place of refuge from the noise and bustle of the city into a quiet place of contemplation, which is what it's going to be. And there was a Buddhist who came to the sessions. The community was very supportive of this idea and said, there's even an advantage for me because being open to the sky, I can have my own religious sort of interpretation of that space. The Byward Market, we were asked to look at a heritage conservation district for that. We did these maps and discovered at least 3 different cultural landscapes. The architectural quality on the left, the way a farmer looks at it with the feed and seed stores, the stables, the hay market, and so on. And one of my graduate students who mapped every bar in the Byward Market, which is a cultural landscape that only exists every night at 10 and then stays till 3 in the morning. And then it disappears again, and it's taken over by these others. This one exists from 7 or 6 in the morning until mid-afternoon. And we said to the city, you have to keep alive these different realities in this one place. The planners have to get away from this idea. In fact, City Council had told us they wanted herringbone brick and cast iron street lamps, and we said, you're not going to get them. This is the Byward Market today. Boulevard Saint Laurent, Montreal. Again, there's been a whole lot of emphasis on that as a historic street which runs across Montreal. And people have done detailed recording of every building. But we said the reality of Boulevard Saint Laurent, you have to look at French, English, and Allophone literature in Quebec to discover what the reality of that place is. And for English Quebecers, it's been the eastern edge of a reality in Montreal, which was focused on the West Island and the downtown. For the Francophone East Montrealers, it's also an edge, which was their screen to what historically has been a lot of the wealth of English Montreal. And for the Allophone community, like Mordecai Richler and others, it was their main street. It was the heart of their community. And it's that complexity of 3 realities that coexist that make that street important, and that should guide how you think about its future. And finally, this is Grand Pré, which just became a World Heritage Site under UNESCO. And it was interesting that Christophe Rivet, who guided this process through understanding an Aboriginal landscape, an Acadian landscape, a German predominantly immigrant landscape, how do you make sense of that and tease it out and create a cultural a layering of cultural landscapes that give this place its value. I've always found archaeologists understand cultural landscape theory very naturally, whereas architects, architectural historians, and commemorative people sometimes struggle a bit with it. So I'm just going to finish with, you can put cultural resource protection here, natural resource protection here, and contemporary design and development, which both of them are nervous about. And this has been the pattern in the 20th century. You can talk about management, which is not just protection, which is a very reactive, static idea, and get a bit more into a flexible idea. But if you look at traditional planning structures, they're very utopian. They zone the world. And you look at impacts, so historic impacts assessments or environmental impact assessment in terms of how that contemporary design and development affects both cultural and natural resources. There are people who would say cultural landscapes are a category of cultural resource which need protection. And my view is very different, that cultural landscapes create an approach by which we can integrate cultural resource protection, natural resource protection, and creative contemporary design and development into a way that respects how a cultural community understands its place, or how a group of cultural communities understands its place. And in terms of assessment, you actually have to say to people doing contemporary design and development, how have you been impacted by the cultural and natural realities of that place? Not how is your development going to impact those resources, but how have they influenced your design as a starting point? And these are three, what I call stage 1, 2, 3 realities. Stage 1, this tide of modernist development, which loved the grid, which loved hierarchy, which loved silos, which loved expertise, which loved initials after your name. And then you had environmentalists and historic preservationists in the 50s, 60s trying to save little bits of our history and our natural environment from this onslaught of suburban development and so on. Then you get stage 2, when these communities both created university programs, professionals, departments, legal networks. We could join the pattern. We could become one more silo among the silos. We could go to court with our own legislation. And this is a very court-driven, win-lose, often confrontational situation. Cultural landscapes are sometimes seen as this category which combines both natural and cultural resources. But what I say to our students is that that's still living within this framework, and really what's happening is that this is the new framework. We're operating in the 21st century, and this is only slowly emerging, in a situation where the modernist experiment is over. Zoning as our primary planning tool is nearing an end. We're not any longer in this situation where we accept all the modernist assumptions, which is what the heritage field did in the 20th century. We simply take a different approach to development, which is to say, if you're not wisely using cultural resources and wisely using natural resources and wisely using creative design and development, you're not doing the right thing. And I don't know what, I'm sure it's the same experience at Memorial. My experience at Willowbank is that this generation that's coming up is very impatient, and they're going to change the world whether we like it or not, because they know they've inherited a place that's unsustainable the way it is. And so these changes are happening, particularly since 2008, which was kind of the nail in the coffin for listening to the so-called experts who knew exactly how the world worked. And we're seeing quite a rapid evolution of policies and frameworks, not only in Canada, but internationally. So I'm going to stop there. I have some images on Willowbank, but I would really like to have a discussion and a reaction and see if there are any, if you disagree, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Julian, for a wonderful presentation. Please, let's thank Julian.